Hello, welcome to Jazz Is.
Jazz Is
MasterClass series
at the National Jazz Museum.
At the National Jazz Museum in Harlem.
I am Sekou McMillan, the curator of special projects.
My name is Albert Marquez, Zach O'Farrell.
My name is Shirazette Titten.
And we are in conversation with the legendary Bertha Hope. Jazz could only have happened here in America.
The key to everything was the radio.
So this world is too dense. 15 minutes isn't enough to cover it all.
Are you ready? I am.
Swing, if I had to define it, is a rhythm, but it's also a feeling. These musicians, these professional musicians are now fighting for their lives. On the last part, we covered jazz and Harlem during the 1920s, the period that we call the Jazz Age, which had that name for a reason, as we said. In the 1920s, jazz and Harlem were synonymous. We had the rise of big bands. We had the first mecca of dancing in Harlem, which was the Savoy Ballroom. And really, the 1920s represented a cultural revolution. In part one of this masterclass, I laid the roots of that revolution, and we covered the rise of jazz and the rise of Harlem. In many ways, everything that played out in that part would repeat and play out again in each of the following parts of this masterclass. And just as the 1920s represented a cultural revolution, the Jazz Age, a loosening of social mores, a challenge to Victorian society, a high point and almost a gravity-free moment in the culture, the 1930s would be the beginning of gravity kicking back in. A moment that also represented a very strong cultural revolution. And that's why I call it the swing revolution. Now, these years are typically considered to be the swing era, and jazz historians would tell you that the swing era began in 1935. And the reason that they say 1935 is because that's when Benny Goodman took off at the Palomar Ballroom in Los Angeles with his great big band. But the really important thing to understand about swing is that by 1935, it was already happening. And it happened in Harlem. Swing was the first music that came out of Harlem. It didn't migrate here. It came here through jazz, but swing was a different idiom. And swing came out of those vital, tumultuous years of the Great Depression and its worst moment of 1931, 32, and 1933. Now, most people who survived the Great Depression through Harlem, and especially those who could remember the 1920s, said, by the Great Depression, we already had a Great Depression in Harlem. The 1920s, for all of the optimism, for all of the energy and enthusiasm that the music conveys to us, were also a period of ever increasing population density in Harlem. Rents were going up, and wages were staying as low as they could and ever were. And as a result, Harlem is becoming an increasingly unstable place to live, a place where the conditions are starting to look more and more like the San Juan Hill that the Black population of New York had left in the 19-teens and or in 1900s. So when we're thinking of Harlem in the Great Depression, it's important to consider what the moment was politically and socially. 1931 was a huge reckoning and a moment that I really consider to be the dawn of the civil rights era, 1931. The popular cause of 1931 was the case of the Scottsboro Boys. And I won't get too far into the Scottsboro Boys, but I recommend that you look into that situation if you don't know about it. It was a tragedy of human rights in Alabama, and a number of leaders and prominent leaders in the Black community, which was now centered in Harlem unquestionably by the turn into 1930, began to lead benefits to defend the Scottsboro Boys and their trial in Alabama. And the Scottsboro Boys was really the beginning of the rise of the left in Harlem. Leftist politics were reaching their strength in the 1930s in Harlem, of folks who were fed up with poor living conditions, economic exploitation, and the conditions that made the 20s the boom time for the patrons coming up to slum in Harlem, but that were ultimately leaving these people out of the prosperity and wealth of those years. But you still had a piece of the cookie in the 1920s. With the Great Depression, the situation for working musicians was dire, to be sure. Patronage was decreasing because the money just wasn't there. And a lot of clubs began to close. A lot of theaters were closing. And even Fletcher Henderson's band, the great dance band of the 1920s that at one time featured Louis Armstrong, the star jazz musician of the 1920s, and of course, probably of all time, was in that band. But Fletcher Henderson's band was on hard times in the early 1930s. The early 1930s was a period when musicians were playing in all kinds of different bands and working as best they could. And there often wasn't a lot of work to be had in those rough, slim years of the early 1930s. Now, still, if the situation was bad in Harlem, it was worse almost everywhere else. Harlem was the best place that you could be a working jazz musician. And as a result, you had all kinds of great musicians coming in from around the country. You have arriving in New York in the early 1930s, Roy Eldridge, arguably the great trumpet player of the swing era and the key link between Louis Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie and bebop. You have Chu Berry, a genius of the tenor saxophone, who Charlie Parker named one of his children after, for goodness sake. You have Billie Holiday, who comes here from Baltimore, and Billie Holiday's music couldn't be inspired by anyone more than Louis Armstrong. And there were so many others. Teddy Wilson, a genius pianist, comes here from Chicago in the early 30s. And a lot of these musicians are working under the leadership of some of the local New Yorkers in the jazz world. And a lot of these musicians came to New York with territory bands. And the bands collapsed because management was being consolidated through big national firms and even radio companies. And the new bands that were being formed in the early 30s were conglomerations of those star musicians. And one of the best bands of that time, which was formed in 1932, was led by New York's own Benny Carter. Benny Carter was a brilliant composer and arranger, and he put together a band that featured Chu Berry and Teddy Wilson and Frankie Newton, another great trumpet player, and all the musicians who'd been playing at after-hours jam sessions, which starting in the 1920s at places like the Rhythm Club, which by the way is still thriving in these years as the main clubhouse of working musicians in Harlem, are creating this whole new idiom of swing. Swing, if I had to define it, is a rhythm, but it's also a feeling. These musicians, these professional musicians, are now fighting for their lives. The musicians who are making swing now are fighting for professional status and to continue the development of jazz, because there's one thing we should know about jazz, is that it is not a stable thing. Jazz, while there is repertoire, while there are classic recordings, what makes jazz so special is that it's alive. It has to be alive to as long as it's being played, because jazz is an improvised music. Jazz is a music that's about what you're feeling now. And those musicians brought their feelings, brought the tumultuous times, and brought the high standards of musicianship of the 1920s to the moment of the early 1930s. Swing was not only a shift, and this is why I call it the swing revolution. Swing was not only a shift in style, but it's important to see it as a shift in mentality. These musicians now saw themselves as political beings, and many of them were. Frankie Newton, as we know, and I just mentioned, was an active member of the Communist Party. Benny Carter was playing for Scottsboro Boys benefits. Rex Stewart, a star trumpeter with Fletcher Henderson and Duke Ellington later in the 30s, was an active student of politics. And this moment of the early 1930s laid the groundwork aesthetically and professionally and also intellectually of what it meant to be a jazz musician in the 1930s. In many ways, the modern jazz musician that we recognize today was born in Harlem in the 1930s. Musicians who were fiercely, who stood by their music fiercely against all odds. And I think that if Harlem can own and be proud of one moment in the history of jazz, and there are many, this to me is the one, those revolutionary years of the 1930s. The mid-30s and by the late 30s saw the payoff of the integrity of those artists. Billie Holiday, by the late 1930s, had become a pop star, and swing became popular music in the mid-1930s. These stars of bands such as Benny Carter and Roy Eldridge, as I already mentioned, and Chu Berry, were becoming household names in the mid-1930s. And the swing era had taken off as the moment when these musicians began to see opportunity to get their dues as creators of their own art form, their own idiom, the sound of swing, which was the soundtrack of America by the late 1930s. Harlem was where it happened. It happened in nightlife and venues around 133rd Street. It happened after the end of Prohibition, which was a boom to nightlife in the 1920s, but reflected a huge change in the economics of Harlem in the early 1930s. And the really important thing I think to understand about the swing revolution in the 1930s is, again, that it happened here in Harlem. What Harlem meant to those musicians, the opportunities that it gave them, and the sense of community that it gave them to experiment together, to be both independent but part of a collective creative incubus, was the foundation that anyone who in the 1930s loved America's popular music owed to Harlem. The opportunity and optimism of the late 1930s was in many ways unmatched and unfulfilled by the early 1940s. What would follow is a tumultuous period, and it would lead to its own revolution and a new music called bebop.